with us, and so in collaboration with Jason in Lancaster. So really looking forward to having you in the coming months, Kelly, and round of applause to you.
Thank you so much. This means I'm going back to Lancaster again.
Yes.
I've
Congratulations.
always loved Lancaster, and I always think Jason is the most fashionable person in the world. So
that's clearly not true for those of you who don't know me, but Kelly is a good
You're
that
trying to figure out what to say.
she's generous with her compliments all the time, undeservedly. And if I could say as well, and but Gabriela isn't here, we will have an additional Marie Curie, and who'll be here not half time like Kelly, but all the time, working with Patrick and myself. So we'll have two new Marie Curies starting this year, which is very nice. And you are all very welcome, even though this is a homecoming in part, and Kelly's also part of the Tromsø team too, or she was for the year as we've been fused together. So Kelly gets to feel like two homecomings, even if she's never been to one of those homes. Get ready for the Arctic, Kelly. You're gonna love it.
Think about this. I'm moving from Taiwan to Tromsø, so it's going to be a very, very, very big difference.
It sounds so Taiwan, Tromsø. It sounds similar. But with that, Anders, why don't we give it over to you to get started, so we can make sure we hear this great talk. And
All right. Thank you, Jason. And thank you, everyone, for coming today. I have the great pleasure of announcing our second speaker of the semester, Mathieu Declerck. And he is joining us from the University of Brussels as a senior research fellow. And he does some really interesting work that's super relevant for our group, both in Lancaster and Tromsø. And today he's going to be talking about the overlap between bilingual language control with domain general cognitive control. So Mathieu, the floor is yours.
Hi, first of all, thanks for the invitation. And I'll just jump into it here in a second. There you go. Okay. So yeah, like Anders said, my talk is about if you can't hear me, let me know. Okay. My talk is about language control and whether it's domain general or not. So first of all, for those who don't know, what is language control? So as a bilingual or a multilingual, whenever you want to produce in a specific language, the representations of that language are not the only ones that are activated. So for example, as a French-English bilingual, you might want to say dog, but then the translation equivalent of dog will also be activated and will also be competing for selection. Now, language control is a process that diminishes that cross-language interference. And so basically it allows us to fluently speak and fluently process language as a bilingual and or multilingual. Now, one of the big questions in this field is to what degree these control processes of language control are domain general or not. Now, theoretically, every possibility has been proposed. So here you can see my interpretation of David Green's very influential inhibitory control model. And according to this model, language control occurs at two levels. So at the task schema level, which are the mental representations of a goal to do something. For example, the goal to produce in a specific language, but it also entails the goal to perform a specific non-linguistic task. So this is really where the domain generality could occur according to this influential model. Then on the other hand, language control is also occurring at a more linguistic level, so at the lemma level, which is where you have the mental representations of each word. So according to David Green, language control is partly domain general because it occurs to some degree at this task schema level, which is where you would expect it to be domain general, and also at this more language specific level at the lemma level. Now, others like Mutter and Alport have proposed that actually language control is only reliant on domain general control processes. So it's entirely at the task schema level within this inhibitory control model. I, unfortunately, apparently over 10 years ago, in 2015, proposed that language control could actually be entirely language specific. As you will see throughout this conversation here, I'm taking that back, but I did propose that in this 2015 paper. So those are the three possibilities explained. There are other models that also talk about this, but these are the three that are good examples of this. So I've been talking about language control. How do we measure this? I would say 95% of the studies investigating language control rely on the language switching paradigm. This is slightly changing recently, but still a large majority of studies rely on this paradigm. So there are different variants of this paradigm. Here I have three of the most prominent. So you have cued language switching, in which participants, based on, for example, a visual cue, produce words in one or the other language. So here, for example, it's a digit naming task. And if there's a gray background, the participants produce Dutch. If it's a black background, participants produce in English. Then you also have alternating language switching, which requires no cues. Participants just switch languages after every second trial. So for example, here it's English, English, Dutch, Dutch, English, English, Dutch, Dutch, and so on. And then you have a voluntary language switching paradigm in which participants can just choose whatever language they want to produce words on each trial. So they are totally free there. Now, what do we typically find with this paradigm? Those are language switch costs. So basically, there are two types of trials that you can collect with this type of paradigm, namely trials in which the previous language was a different one. Those are switch trials, and trials in which the previous language was in the same language. Those are repetition trials. And what we then typically find is that there's a switch cost. So it's harder to switch from one language to another than staying in the same language. How do we explain this? Well, there's a couple of explanations. This is the one proposed by, I think, David Green. So this is an L1 switch trial. So to start from an L1 switch trial, you obviously first need to produce in your second language. So this is in French English bilingual producing English. So they're producing the word tree, which means that they will have to inhibit French. So those bars are the base activation of here English and here French. The red is how much inhibition that requires to produce in the other language. So to produce in English, the word tree, you need to inhibit your French. Now, what is assumed is that this inhibition persists. So even if after inhibiting French, and you then need to produce in French, this inhibition from the previous trial will persist into the current trial, making switch trials more difficult than repetition trials, because in repetition trials, there will be very little, there might be inhibition on the previous trial. For example, if you go from English to English, there might be inhibition on the French side, but it will not really impact your following trial, because the persisting inhibition doesn't really impact you, because that language is not the one that you will be using, the one that was inhibited. So that's one explanation. Other explanations are that it takes quite some effort and some time to implement inhibition, and you are expected to inhibit your non-target language more in the current trial if the previous trial was another language, because that other language might actually persist in activation, meaning that you will have to inhibit that other language more. It will have a larger activation because previously you used that language. So currently you need to, inhibit it more than if it's a repetition trial, and you don't really need to implement any kind of inhibition. This is a meta-analysis that we ran some years ago, quite controversial meta-analysis. But the part that I'm going to explain now is not controversial. So this was based on 73 production studies. And there we found that language transition, which allows us, which is the measure of switch cost, was very robust throughout this meta-analysis, indicating that these switch costs are very robust across studies. And this is also something that I've experienced myself. Whenever you try to publish something, not observing switch costs in a production study at least is almost guaranteed to be a result that can go into a very good journal, because it is so rare to not observe switch costs in production studies that people are really looking for, like, what is actually causing these switch costs, and also what is causing them to be abolished. Now to the meat of it. So this was the introductory part. Now to what can we actually say about language control and how domain general it all is. Now, there's been a lot of studies on this topic. Well, a fair few. But here I'm first going to talk about an aging study by Calabria and colleagues. In this study, they looked at 3 age groups, so young, middle-aged, and elderly. These were Catalan-Spanish bilinguals. And they performed a language switching task. So in language switching task, they had to name 4 cognate and 4 non-cognate pictures. And again, based on like a flag, for instance, I think it was a flag here. They had to name the cognate or non-cognate pictures in either Catalan or Spanish. On the other hand, you have the non-linguistic switching task is what they call here. So the task switching task. And there they had 3 shapes and they were combined with 3 colors. And they had to do like a matching task. So I think they saw 2 stimuli on top and 1 stimuli at the bottom. And they had to indicate based on a cue whether the bottom stimulus corresponded either based on the color or either based on the shape with the left or right stimulus on top. So there they had to switch between making a decision about the shape or about the color. And what they found was that that task switch costs showed an effect of age. So the older you get, the larger the switch costs become. However, this was not the case for the language switch costs, which indicates that there might be some differences there between the control processes measured by non-linguistic and by a bilingual task. Interestingly, a couple of years before that, Weisberger and colleagues actually found the exact opposite. They found that language switch costs were affected by age, but not task switch costs. which makes these results obviously a little bit harder to interpret, but both show that there's a disconnect between language and task switch costs and the factor of age. There's been plenty of studies that rely on very similar tasks as this study by Calabria. That's why I chose to explain this one first here. And this made me think, well, we are looking at very, very different tasks when comparing task and language switching. And that is important, I think, because if you would compare two task switch experiments that are vastly different in all the ways that these language and task switch tasks are different, you would also find immense differences between those two. So are we really looking here at a language versus task switch difference, or are we finding just that the characteristics that are being changed between those two that have nothing to do between switching between languages and switching between tasks, are they not causing those differences? So just to give like an idea here with this study of Calabria. Again, this is not a bad study, far from it. This is a very good study. I'm just using it as a reference of how these tasks can be different. So the stimuli are different. The response modalities are different. For example, in language switching, it's focal, and the task switching, it's button presses. The response alternatives are, so the number of response alternatives are different. Usually you have a lot more response alternatives in a language switching task than a task switching task, and so on and so on. Like the tasks are obviously also different. So they are extremely different from each other. And so this is something that with this 2017 paper, we wanted to like see if you make them as similar as possible, do we still find these differences, or can you actually find some commonalities? So this was a study with 3 experiments that I'll quickly go over. So this is the first study here. This is a study with German English bilinguals, as you can see. And in the language switching section of this experiment, participants saw just 2 stimuli, 8 or 1, and they just had to name them based on the color background. In the task switching section of it, participants had to switch between either indicate, again, vocally, indicating whether the 8 and 1 were larger or smaller than 5, and whether they were odd or even. So those were the 2 tasks, an odd or even task or a magnitude task. Sorry. So basically here we have 2, like a language and task switching task that use the same stimuli, have the same number of response alternatives. So both have 4 response alternatives, and they have the same response modality. So everything is done vocal. What we observed was smaller language than task switch costs. So we still found, when we directly then compared those switch costs, this is not something that other studies did, but here we felt comfortable doing it because we made them so similar. We still found differences. So a significantly smaller language than task switch costs. This made us go into experiment 2, where we tried to make basically everything the same. The only difference was in the language switching section, participants were switching between languages, and in the task switching section, participants were switching between 2 tasks. So if I'll quickly can go over this. So this was again with German English bilinguals, by the way. And the stimuli were just not 2 stimuli, there were 8 stimuli, digits 1 to 9, but not 5. And participants in the first block of the language switching study had to consistently do a magnitude task while switching between English and German. In the parity block, they had to do a parity task while consistently switching between English and German. Then going to the task switching section of it, they had to switch between magnitude and parity while consistently producing in English, and then the same for the second block, but consistently producing in German. And what we observed here was actually similar language and task switch costs, which we were very happy with. But, you know, this was one experiment, so we decided let's try to replicate this. So we used different tasks, different stimuli, and also different bilinguals. So this last experiment was with French-English bilinguals. And instead of the magnitude and parity task, we asked the participants to do a picture naming task or a category naming task. So the category naming task is obviously a little bit more difficult. You have to name the category of these 8 pictures that we used. So for example, if you see a chair, you say furniture. If you see a hammer, you say tool. If you see shark, you see fish, and so on. What we observed here was, again, similar language and task switch costs. One little asterisk here is that we did find a significant difference between language and task switch costs and the error rates, but error rates were so small that we should basically not have run the analysis because there were just not enough data to really make an informed to actually deduce anything from that analysis. Also important here is that these 3 experiments that I just discussed, we also looked at the correlations there between language and task switch costs, and we found significant positive correlations between language and task switch costs. Again, indicating that there might be quite some underlying mechanisms that are overlapping between language and task switch costs. By the way, if anybody has any questions throughout the presentations, feel free to ask away. So those were the behavioral studies, behavioral experiments that we ran. After that, I went to San Diego and did also a similar study, but with ERPs. So these are obviously different bilinguals. So these are English-Spanish bilinguals. And unlike the German English and the French English, these were not all of them, but mostly heritage Spanish speakers. So usually very high proficiency. And again, we had slightly different tasks here. So instead of picture naming, we asked the participants to name the color, because with the picture naming in the last experiment, that was too easy almost compared to the category naming. The category naming is just very difficult. So we want to equalize the tasks a little bit more. So each picture was in a different color. I think there were 4 colors and there were 4 categories as far as I can remember. And here, as you can see, the visual cues were not a color background, but they were a shape. So the shape indicated whether to name specific stimuli and a specific language, and then also in a task switching part of it, to name to name a stimuli regarding a specific task. And what we observed behaviorally, at least, was again similar language and task switch costs, which is in line with the previous 2 experiments. And then we also looked at the ERPs, of course. So first we looked at the Q-locked ERP. So the Q was always shown a little bit before the picture, which allowed us then to look at these Q-locked results. And we looked at 2 time windows, which were informed by previous research. And basically, we observed some effects, mainly in both time windows, the same effect. A larger negativity in switched and repetition trials at anterior sites, which is usually related to goal maintenance, and a larger positivity in switched and repetition trials at more posterior sites. And this is related to task rule activation. And as you can see here, we observed no significant switch cost differences between language and task switching whatsoever. But we wanted to have a little bit more of an assurance that this was not due to, a power issue or something. So we took 2 representative electrodes and also analyzed this with Bayesian factors. So basically, we did a Bayesian factor null hypothesis analysis to see how likely it was that the null hypothesis would be chosen over the alternative hypothesis. And as you can see, at least for FC, this was 3 times more likely, well, more than 3 times more likely, that the null hypothesis was actually correct over the alternative hypothesis, with the alternative hypothesis being language and task switch costs are significantly different. We then did the same at picture locked with the pictures. So we again had 2 time windows, slightly different this time. The first one is the same. The first one we wanted to see the N200, which we failed at both times. But the second one is different for the Q and picture locked. Here again, we found a kind of a persisting effect throughout those 2 time windows. We found a larger negativity in switch compared to repetition trials. And this is also something that some previous studies have been finding, basically, and in language switching. And it is typically related to the N400 component. So it's not we don't really call it an N400, we call it an N400-like component because it doesn't have all the characteristics. But so basically it's an N400-like component, and it indicates that word meaning retrieval is more difficult in switch than repetition trials. Again, we found no significant differences between language and task switching. And again, we also did a Bayesian analysis on these 2 representative electrodes. And again, we found that they were 3 or more times more likely to indicate the null hypothesis. That there's evidence for the null hypothesis over the alternative hypothesis. I am going very fast here. So if there are any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I just noticed the time. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Hi. I was just wondering, in this study, did you also look at participants' proficiency, language proficiency in both languages as well, English and Spanish?
No, we didn't. So this is one of those things that are tricky to do here, because basically you have an analysis. I mean, you could do it separately, but basically in your analysis, you're taking language and task switching together. And usually in those studies, and this is probably my mindset from previous studies that prevails. In the task switching, there's usually no language incorporated. So including language proficiency there is usually out of the question, because you can't really include the task switching part into it. However, now that I'm saying all of this, I obviously recognize that we do include language in the task switching sections. So we could actually go back and look at that. This is, Again,
that would be interesting. Yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah.
I do have to say, I don't think it would have such a big impact, because So first we had a German English population, which has usually a very high proficiency in English. The English Spanish, because they're heritage bilinguals, also tends to have very high proficiency in both languages. The French group, on the other hand, tend to have much lower proficiency in English. This is not a characteristic that I'm trying to put forward here. This is me just having done quite a lot of research in France with bilinguals and seeing that, you know, for example, the Lexdales tend to be on the lower side. So having these two groups gives me some reassurance that I'm not saying there might not be any quantitative differences, there might be, but I would not expect there to be qualitative differences because we have these two groups that I expect to have, you know, I wouldn't call them two, I wouldn't call them, you know, I wouldn't say that they're on opposite ends of the spectrum, but you know, they show the range a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
because it would be interesting just because with executive function, you could look at if you had proficiency there, you could see if it's kind of a response that's almost more automatic, like if you're looking at kind of domain overlap and things, or proficiency means they have to put more effort into it, or if there's anything like that. But it's still a very interesting thing to look at. Very, very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say the automatic thing. Well,
Yeah.
you know, you could look at the first language, which should be then automatic. However, it is most likely impacted by the previous trial, which is not automatic. So
Yeah.
that could have an impact. So that my initial thought there didn't make sense. Yeah, I agree. So this is something we could definitely look at. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Let me go back. So we were at the picture locked here. Basically, then this ERP study is very much in line with this 2017 paper, showing that you can actually find very similar underlying control processes when comparing language and task switching when they are very similar. And even more so here because you know, the ERPs allow us to tease apart many aspects of these control processes. And at no point did we find anything other than similarities. I mean, you can also see that with FC and PZ on the left side. So both for the picture locked and the queue locked, they are very similar. So yeah. And then I'm already coming at the last experiment. Like I said, I'm going way too fast. This was supposed to be, when I tried it was much longer, but oh, here we are. So this is a very recent study by Aaron van den Dalen, who's here. And by the way, he recently got a grant to do exactly research on the topic that I'm talking about today. So we are hoping, well, with Aaron, we're pretty sure that a lot more interesting stuff on this topic will come out in the next couple of years. So he ran 2 experiments, again, with a different group of bilinguals. We like to investigate different group of bilinguals in my lab. So this was with Italian-English bilinguals. So in the first experiment, participants had to perform a magnitude or a parity judgment task either in L1 or L2. So basically, this grid here that I've been showing, now everything is mushed together. So everything is, so language switching is occurring while task switching is occurring as a possibility, or only language switching, or only task switching, or only repetitions. So everything is together in this new experiment. And then in a second experiment, he did the exactly same thing. Again, Italian, English bilinguals, but he relied on different tasks. Again, they were producing in their L1 or their L2. And they either had to perform a picture naming task or a category naming task, similar to I think the third experiment of the 2017 paper. And here are the possibilities. Like I said, this allows us to look at 3 different kinds of trials. Whereas before we look at 2 different kinds of trials, just repetition or switch. Here we have repetition, in which both the same language and the same task are used. A language switch, in which there's a difference in the language than the previous trial, but you stay with the same task. A task switch, in which you stay in the same language as the previous trial, but you use a different task. And then a dual switch, where both the language and the task switches. Now, why did we do this? So, God dang it. We know from previous studies that in task switching, at least, so with non-linguistic tasks, when you allow a participant to switch, whether it's 1 switch or 2 switches, typically what you find is that there's no difference, which is very counterintuitive, I would think. Like, if you need to switch 2 aspects of the previous trial, my intuition would have been, oh, you're obviously going to find a larger switch cost for switching between 2 things than just switching between 1. Now, that's not what they have found, and how they explain that is based on the task set. So what they assume is that you have a mental representation of each task that you're currently performing. And if that changes, certain parameters in that task set needs to change. Now, whether you change 1 thing or 2 things apparently makes no difference for the task set. That is their explanation of why you would find similar switching costs when switching from one or two different parameters. And so we wanted to see whether we can find a similar effect here, which again to me is very counterintuitive. And we thought this would be interesting to do with language because, first of all, people tend to think that language is a special kind of task. Not even a task, it's a special kind of thing. I mean, I'm sure since most of us here investigate language, we think language is special in some specific ways. So, but also language is obviously a task that is very much like, overused. We use it so often during daily life, whereas a magnitude or parity judgment task, that's not something I do in my everyday life, or picture naming or category naming even. Those are not, I don't go around looking at a banana and just saying banana, and don't go looking around seeing a table saying table. You know what I mean? Language, on the other hand, is just way more practiced. So these could be causing differences. In both of these experiments, we had 4 stimuli, and the magnitude task is a magnitude, it's not larger, smaller than 5, unlike the previous studies. It's larger, smaller than 3, because the stimuli were 1, 2, 4, and 5. And the 4 pictures were a chair, skirt, spoon, and shark. Okay, let's go have a look-see at the results. And very similar to what has been observed in task switching with non-linguistic tasks, is that whether you switch between 1 thing, so this is just a task switch, this is just a language switch, and this is a double switch. And these are repeating both language and task switching and tasks. What we found is that the double switch, again, is not significantly different from just a single task or language switch, which really boggled my mind, and I think Aaron's as well. Hence why there's 2 studies that you're looking at, 2 experiments that you're looking at here, because we wanted to be sure that what we found was, actually there. So we were very happy to see, this basically replication of the results. And to us, this indicates that there might be this huge overlap because just like task switching, the language switch in this task set is just one of the parameters of the task set. And if you think back on the inhibitory control model, this fits very well in the idea of the task schema, where the task schema, so the goal to perform a specific task, where using a specific language can be a specific task, that fits very well there as well. You could just put the task set ID in the task schemas, and that would be, would perfectly explain the results that we observe in these two experiments. So this brings me to the take-home message. So based on previous research, we would say that there's not really a lot of clarity on whether language control relies on domain general processes, which is, controversial to some, but that's just what the results show at the moment. There's so many studies that do not find, any overlap, or find only partial, if at best partial, overlap between language and task switching, that this is still the prevailing idea. Yet when you then consider using a similar methodology, like I have shown here in the 6 experiments that I've shown here, there is evidence that points in the direction that there is at least some domain generality. Now, you could say the tasks that you have been using have a linguistic component, because even the second experiment here, and I think also the first experiment here of this 2017 paper, the participants in the task switching section had to produce language vocally, which means they were using language to produce the responses. It was not finger presses or button presses, button presses, for instance. So you could say, well, the experiments shown here indicate that within a domain, there is some overlap between the control processes. So whether it's in a more monolingual setting or a more bilingual setting, for instance. However, we also have done that kind of research separate to this research. So where we compare switch costs in a bilingual setting and in a monolingual setting. In a monolingual setting, for example, so this is the 2020 paper that I cite here. We let participants, for example, switch between formal and informal language, which is obviously within the same language. So they're not switching between languages. They're just switching between two types of languages within, for example, that was French. And there we found qualitative differences between the two. So I would not say that just because we are looking within the domain of language, that you would automatically expect there to be overlapping control processes. That was it. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. Or any questions about language control is also fine. Doesn't have to be specifically about this.
Can I stop your recording? Stop your recording?
Yes, please. Thank you. That's